All right. So we are almost at the end of our latest printed notes. I do have the new notes. They're not yet printed, so I should have those out on Sunday. We will probably get into a little bit of those, but it's mainly just further detail on this First Council of Nicaea before we move on. We've been talking about the range of 100 to 325 AD. That's where these notes end, is at 325. So we've talked about kind of the advent of the concept of a single elder or bishop over individual churches and how that kind of built up into a regional and ultimately a universal concept or construct, ultimately culminating in the formation of the Pope and the archbishops and the dioceses and all of that stuff. And we've kind of narrowed in on the formation of the actual Catholic Church, at least based on what we have recorded. If we're to trust everything that's recorded in terms of what Eusebius records and so forth, it sounds like the Catholic Church in its actual form came about somewhere around 250-ish, 250, 275, somewhere around there. And so as we kind of delve into some of these issues, there were actually a lot of councils or quote-unquote synods that gathered to discuss doctrine, to discuss organization, and so forth. But there were 7 main ones that sort of affected, I'm not going to say Christianity today, because true Christianity hasn't been affected at all of the Bible. However, our religious community, and especially the Catholic Church as we know it, these 7 councils ultimately helped to formulate everything that came after. And many of these councils were held early on in these 4th and 5th centuries, and then there were a couple, the latest ones really kind of took place around 1000 AD in the Middle Ages. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those a little bit later. So this First Council of Nicaea, ecumenical, it means universal. It's meant to be representative of the full church of Christianity, so to speak. And it was the first, quote-unquote, ecumenical council of the church. Keep in mind, a lot of times people reference Acts chapter 15. We talked a little bit about this last week, and how that Acts chapter 15 was kind of the first biblical example of a ecumenical council. That's not true. Okay, the Acts chapter 15, we often describe it as the council or the meeting in Jerusalem, but ultimately keep in mind that those who met in Jerusalem, it was all about the teachers who had come from Jerusalem teaching that Gentiles had to be circumcised before they could be baptized. And it centered around the elders in Jerusalem as well as the apostles. And that's what that meeting was all about. And so when this letter was sent out, it wasn't Jerusalem saying, listen to our authority. It was basically the Church of Jerusalem saying, these men that came from us and they taught you this, that is not according to the truth. And we want to clarify and make that clear that they don't have the authority of the church here or of the elders or the apostles in teaching what they taught. And so there was nothing unseemly about their issuing that statement. I think it was good and important that they did. It provided comfort for the Gentile Christians who were concerned about the situation. But it did not involve multiple churches. It did not involve multiple representatives of these different churches or bishops over these different churches. It was all based really on the Church of Jerusalem and what these men were teaching coming from Jerusalem. Most significantly, it resulted in the first, quote-unquote, uniform Christian doctrine. Keep in mind, quote-unquote, Christian doctrine or Christian teaching only comes from the New Testament, doesn't come from anybody else, but they call it the Nicene Creed. And for the most part, we'll talk a little bit more about the Nicene Creed here in a little bit, but the Nicene Creed, for the most part, dealt with the Godhead, the nature of God, and whether or not Christ was truly fully human, or was he truly just fully an apparition and not human at all? Is Christ and the Father the same entity or same person? Or all three all just one person? It was those types of debates that were taking place during this period of time. With the creation of the creed, a precedent was established for subsequent local and regional councils of bishops. And so kind of because this first one took place, then you had a myriad of other get-togethers to talk about some of these things. Again, there were 6 more major ones where major events took place that kind of helped create the formation of our kind of religious history, so to speak. Again, air quotes. Kind of ended up creating statements of belief and canons of doctrinal, quote-unquote, orthodoxy, the intent being to define unity of beliefs for the whole of Christendom. And it's interesting, if you ever look up the difference between Christianity and Christendom, Christendom is not the same as Christianity. Christendom is really kind of a label placed on, in particular, the religion of the day as of Constantine. Okay, so more specifically Roman Catholicism, even though it's a little bit oversimplistic, it's really ultimately Christendom represents the establishment and orthodox teaching of Roman Catholicism. So Christianity, that's why they kind of differentiate between Christianity and Christendom. And this is kind of part of why, is because it defined the unity of beliefs for the whole of, not Christianity, because the New Testament defines the teaching of Christianity, but of Christendom, the form that the majority of churches tended to coalesce into regarding the Roman Catholic Church were recognized under Christendom. Any thoughts so far through this? Okay. It's interesting because the actual concept derived from the Greek, ancient Greek, literally the inhabited one. Ecumenical means worldwide, but generally is assumed to be limited to the known inhabited earth. In other words, mainly that which was mapped and known. That's what ecumenical, it's worldwide, universal. I found it interesting that the actual Greek was the inhabited one, which is that part of the earth known to be inhabited, is kind of the concept there. And at this time in history, it's synonymous with the Roman Empire. The earliest extant uses of the term for council are Eusebius' Life of Constantine, which states he convoked an ecumenical council, and the letter in 382 to Pope Damascus I and the Latin bishops from the First Council of Constantinople. Weirdly, you would think First Council of Nicaea there would be a Second Council of Nicaea and a Third Council of Nicaea. That's not how it worked. There was the First Council of Nicaea, then the second quote-unquote council was the First Council of Constantinople. So it's kind of weird how they set it up. But the concept is that Eusebius recorded that Constantine was the one who kind of pushed for this effort in this first gathering, if you will, of official, recognizable canon, recognizable decrees and so forth regarding the teaching of the church. And that's part of part of the reason why it was called the Council of Council of Nicaea, was because when you include the concept of Constantine, I want to say Constantinople for some reason. When you include Constantine, he was a part of the process. Even from a biblical perspective, and let's forget all of the lack of authority for what they were doing anyway. Constantine was kind of like I want to say he headed the proceedings, but he was definitely an authoritative figure in the proceedings. And he was emperor, certainly, but he had no specific religious authority. So it was kind of hinky anyway. One purpose of the council was to resolve disagreements arising from within the Church of Alexandria over the nature of the Son in his relationship to the Father. In particular, whether the Son had been, quote-unquote, begotten by the Father from his own being and therefore having no beginning, or else created out of nothing and therefore having a beginning. It's kind of confusing, though, because there were actually 3 main parties. There was the concept that Jesus had always existed along with the Father and the Holy Spirit. That's what we believe, that all 3 had always been. No 3 ever had a beginning, and no one of them ever came from the other. Then there was this concept of the Son being begotten by the Father from his own being, as if Jesus was indeed deity and God, but because he kind of separated from the Father, which is kind of a weird concept. Not that he was created, but that somehow there was some sort of mitosis that took place or whatever, and he became. And then there was the concept that God created Jesus, thus he was like an angel or an archangel, so to speak, with more power or whatever. So you had kind of these differing ideas and thoughts about what is the nature of Jesus, what is the nature of the Father. And that's part of the reason why this council was kind of called, because there were a lot of conflicting ideas. St. Alexander of Alexandria and Athanasius took the first position, which, again, we talked about a little bit. We haven't talked about Athanasius yet. We talked about Arius. We talked about that concept, old school version of Arianism with an I, not a Y, which kind of confuddles this, whether or not Jesus was a created being and so forth. They took the first position that Christ had no beginning, but he was begotten of the Father, whereas Arius, the presbyter Arius, from whom the term Arianism comes, took the second, which is that Jesus was a created being. The council decided against the Arians overwhelmingly. All but two agreed to sign the creed, and these two, along with Arius, were banished to Illyria. Interestingly enough, we talked a little bit about this regarding Eusebius Pamphili, or Eusebius the historian, that we talked about last week, and how important it is to understand kind of his background and kind of the bias with which he recorded events, and perhaps even at times embellished, we'll use a generous term, some of what he recorded. There was a second Eusebius as well, which kind of makes it a little bit confusing, because there were two Eusebiuses. One was a historian, one was a bishop of a church. And the sources that I've read, some have attributed Eusebius the historian as having sided with Arius and then recanting and coming back. And then other sources reference the second Eusebius, which was a bishop, who never recanted, and he stuck with Arius. At some point in there, you would think that through history, Eusebius has gotten, the story of Eusebius got merged somewhere with each other, the two Eusebiuses. So I don't know which one is true, but regardless, at least according to most of the records, Eusebius the historian, whether he ever sided with Arius or not, did eventually decide, no, Arius is wrong, whereas the other Eusebius is still debated. Anyway, another result of the council was an agreement on when to celebrate Easter, the most, quote-unquote, important feast of the ecclesiastical calendar, decreed in an epistle to the Church of Alexandria, in which is simply stated, "We also send you the good news of the settlement concerning the Holy Passover, Easter, namely that in answer to your prayers, this question also has been resolved. All the brethren in the East who have hitherto followed the Jewish practice will henceforth observe the custom of the Romans, and of yourselves, and of all us who from ancient times have kept Easter together with you." I found this very interesting because ultimately, and we're going to see how over the coming centuries, in the 400s and 500s, there's going to be multiple splits within the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church. But one of the very initial or first ones is going to be between the Eastern and the Western, okay, which would ultimately provide the Eastern Orthodox churches and so forth, the Western Orthodox Church. But the Roman Catholic Church is going to split into two groups. The Eastern is going to carry the more Jewish traditions, whereas the Western is going to reject all of that for more Roman traditions. And ultimately, that's how the two are kind of going to veer off from one another. And we kind of saw that listed on one of our timelines. The Great Schism was listed as taking place, I think it was in 1045 or somewhere around in there, where kind of the last great split that ultimately divided the Eastern and Western Roman Catholic churches took place. This is one of the issues, was that the Eastern side of things, they wanted to keep hold to the Jewish tradition and the Jewish recognizing of when the Passover would be based on the Jewish calendar, whereas the Western side wanted to go to the Roman calendar, and therefore it was I guess you could say a quote-unquote movable date. The Jewish side of things, it was a set day. It didn't matter if it was on a Sunday or a Wednesday. This day of this month, that's when it took place, regardless of what name of the day of the week it was. Whereas the Roman calendar took a more, I guess you could say, more uniform approach in terms of the day. It was the Sunday after the Saturday, after the 50 days in commemoration of the resurrection of Jesus. Keep in mind that there is no New Testament example of the keeping of Easter. Okay? Even then, Easter itself, the term Easter is a pagan term. But the concept of Jesus' resurrection, it being celebrated once a year, there is no New Testament example of that. In fact, if anything, there's the opposite. Because at one point, Paul wanted to get back to Jerusalem was it for Easter or Passover or for some other date? He wanted to get back for Pentecost. Okay, and if Easter was a big deal in the early church back then, you'd think get there a month earlier and celebrate Easter with the church, and then he'd be there for Pentecost. But that wasn't he had no intention whatsoever, it had nothing to do, no mention, no reference whatsoever of he wished he could have been there for Easter, but he just couldn't make it. There is nothing like that. And so it's important to understand. However, in the following decades, in the mid-100s or so, is when this, I guess you could say, tradition started of observing Easter or the Passover remembrance of Jesus, his resurrection and so forth. And that has been culminating and simmering and brewing and becoming a really big deal. Okay? Anything through this so far? Yeah.
We know we celebrate the resurrection of Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection, but we're going to pick a day.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, the wisdom of God in the New Testament is to select what day for that remembrance? Sunday. Once a year Sunday? No. It's every Sunday, every Lord's Day. That's the wisdom of God in having established it the way he did. And keep in mind that all of this is stemming from tradition. Okay, and this is part of the reason why, as members of the Church of Christ, especially to the extent that so much that was ingrained going from the Reformation and so forth to today, many of the denominations and so forth that we know of, and some of our friends may be part of, and maybe even we may have grown up in, are based in tradition. Okay, there's maybe some truth in there too, but the majority of it is tradition. And that's why the churches of Christ tend to have a very, or at least you kind of see it on two sides of the spectrum. There is a firm rejection of tradition, and then on the other side, there is the appreciation of tradition, because that's the concept of the New Testament where Paul refers to the traditions that we've given you and so forth. Of course, Paul uses this term in association with the teachings of Christ. But this is why it's so important for us to distinguish between traditions of men and the doctrines of Christ, because even as of the 325, really this was building up for about 150 years before this. This all has to do with tradition. Nothing in Scripture. It's just tradition. Anything else? All right. Historically significant as the first effort to attain consensus in the church through an assembly representing all of Christendom, and that's in particular that's true in terms of compared to the New Testament church, that this was the first time this took place because the New Testament church didn't do things this way. The council was the first occasion where the technical aspects of Christology were discussed. Does anybody know what Christology is? Study of Christ, specifically. Okay, there's a broad sense in which Christology is the study of the Word of Christ, but the more specific sense is the nature of Christ, where he came from, how he came to be, what his nature is, and so forth. And that's what they call Christology. Though it is a precedent that set for subsequent, through it a precedent was set for subsequent general councils to adopt creeds and canons. This council is generally considered the beginning of the period of the first 7 ecumenical councils in the history of Christianity. History of Christianity. All right. And so that's where our notes stop. So any thoughts through this? Yeah, we noticed this great schism in the 11th century. That was 1045, I think was the exact date. But there were several major schisms. The first one really took place in 405, and there were a couple others. When we get to the 400s, we'll talk a little bit more about those, where the separation of the Eastern and Western Roman Catholic churches began to really start to tear apart. and ultimately what culminated in the Great Schism, where they ultimately just went their separate ways, and there was no more recognition of authority from one to the other. All right, anything else through these notes? Okay, so going forward, okay, we spent a lot of time dealing with specific individuals in our notes. Going forward, there will be a few. We're going to talk about Jerome a little bit. We're going to talk about Theodosius. We'll talk about him a little bit. But aside from that, we're going to mainly talk about events, because specifically at this point, individuals are not nearly as important as they were, mainly because the main records of the early quote-unquote church fathers, most of the Roman Catholic Church was built upon what was said that they said. Ignatius, Clement I, Irenaeus, Eusebius, all these individuals were key components of what people based, and in particular the Roman Catholic Church based its beliefs upon. After really 325, it wasn't so much about individuals as it was about events, because as of that point was when you really had the first cohesive formation of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, and so really as of, again, 275-ish, the Roman Catholic Church in form is there. Now in 325, it's cohesive, in some ways almost a protocol-oriented, what's my word? Official, formal, there's another word there. Anyway, it fits within that structure that is more commonly associated now with the Roman Catholic Church. So, going forward then into our new notes, again, I'll have these new notes for everybody Sunday printed out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep kind of just a brief timeline to kind of help us to remember the notes past, because it's, it's all very wordy. So we can just kind of keep in track what the timeline has been so far. And so again, from 150 to 175, that episcopal polity where you had one bishop or one elder over a church and so forth, that provided the basis. And then as of 220 AD, remember, and I mention this because I feel like it's important to point out the holes that have been suggested or argued in the past over the established timeline that the Catholic Church presents. For instance, as of 220 AD, this is where in 1886 that he was a Presbyterian preacher. He argued that Calixtus, a bishop of Rome, he forged letters in the name of Ignatius to garner support for a monarchical episcopate, the one elder over a single church, and modeled Ignatius after his own life to give precedent for his own authority. Whether or not that's exactly true, we don't know. But that's what has been argued because of the differentiation between what we know about Ignatius, and then all of a sudden you have these other letters that are very different in style and wording and so forth. And most of the religious scholars reject those letters as being of Ignatius, which is what spurred this argument that it was actually Calixtus in 220 that tried to push this narrative. That fits our timeline, because between 175-ish and 250 is when really the formation of the Catholic Church took place. And so that kind of fits within that timeline. And again, I'm going to mention when we get to the 405 or 4, I think it's 415, there's another individual who is said to have perhaps created the Catholic Church. That it was kind of still nebulous up until 425 or 415, whatever it was, and then all of a sudden, this man kind of brought it into specific form. We'll talk about that when we get there. So, 250, the Roman Catholic Church organization begins to emerge. Again, this is based on the established timeline that we have, without taking into effect or account the arguments saying that no, it hadn't happened yet. We talked about the 100 to 325. This is the Ante-Nicene period before Nicaea. And then in 312, 313, Constantine, remember in 312, he sees that flaming cross in this sign conquer. He becomes a Christian because his army wins the battle. And then as a result of that, as a direct result of that, he legalized Christianity. And then later he officially called Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. 325, we have the First Council of Nicaea, which is known as the First Ecumenical Council. And so these are some of the specifics that are listed. In fact, if you Google the First Ecumenical Council, or First Council of Nicaea, and any of these councils, the actual texts of what was discussed, kind of like the minutes, so to speak, of the councils, that you can read them. Okay, so they're all there to be read. The Council of Nicaea passed 20 disciplinary canons for the better government of the church. By one, this is canon number 6 of these, the bishops of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch were declared to possess jurisdiction over the churches in their respective provinces. So it's interesting because if it is true, and this is one of the arguments that is made about this, I can't remember his name, this Pope in 415 or whatever it was, the argument that he kind of solidified the Catholic Church. This is one of the arguments, is that it was still nebulous and started to take firm form starting in 325, but it wasn't fully done in 325. And that could be, because this is really the first, I guess you could say, canonized declaration that these individuals have specific, and I say individuals, the bishops of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, they have basically, they're archbishops. They have regional authority over these areas. So any churches within those areas answer to him. And that's where we kind of get the archdiocese and all that stuff. Thoughts through this? All right. The agenda of the Synod, again, Synod Council, included the Arian question regarding the relationship between God the Father and the Son, not only in his incarnate form as Jesus, but also in his nature before the creation of the world. So discussing the nature of Jesus while he was on the earth. Was he just an apparition? Was he fully human? Was he a mixture of the two? That actually was a theory that came up, that his body was flesh, but his mind was spirit. It was weird. I'd never heard of that one before. But also, what was Jesus before the earth was created? Was he a created being? Did he just pop into existence? Are the Father and the Son one in divine purpose only, or also one in being? Then, of course, the date of celebration of Easter, the Meletian Schism. There were a lot of individuals that came up with these weird theories and weird thoughts that created followings of people going after them. And as a result, the church, quote unquote, had to decide, are we going to allow these heretics to be part of the church? Are we going to reject them? And so this was one of them. The Meletian Schism, it dealt with the nature of the Godhead. And I've looked more into the specifics of exactly what that meant. It's very confusing. And it's somewhat contradictory, some of the specifics of it. If you want to try to read through it and make sense of it yourself, go for it, because I couldn't really. I was going to put details down in there, and I was like, well, both of the main arguments of this group contradict one another. I don't understand why that is. So I couldn't. Even some of my sources said we don't really understand what this was about. But anyway, it was an issue dealing with the nature of the Godhead that ultimately was rejected. Various matters of church discipline, which resulted in 20 canons. Organizational structure of the church focused on the ordering of the episcopacy. I hate that word. Dignity standards for the clergy. Issues of ordination at all levels and of suitability of behavior and background for clergy. Reconciliation of the lapsed, which is those who have fallen away. Establishing norms for public repentance and penance. Readmission to the church of heretics and schismatics, those who have separated from the church, including issues of when reordination and or rebaptism were to be required. Notice rebaptism. This is the first time, at least as far as I know, in terms of the actual written history of after the New Testament where the term rebaptism is brought up. That's the first time I've seen it. That one. Practice, including the place of deacons and the practice of standing at prayer during liturgy. Liturgy. How do you pronounce that word? Liturgical. Liturgical. That's a weird word. Okay. No, I don't. And so these are kind of the main things to be discussed in this First Council of Nicaea. And notice how, again, going to the argument, again, I'm not sure either way whether or not it's true, but it does help the argument that this one pope in 415 kind of actually created the formation of the Catholic Church, because these things were discussed as of 325, which suggests that these were not actually in place before 325. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church as we know it, that suggests that it didn't exist at least before 325. But then even these don't really fully cover what the Roman Catholic Church was going to become. And so I do see the argument being made that as of 415, this Pope kind of actually created the Roman Catholic Church in the form we're familiar with it. It had been building to that point, but I can see that, I can understand the argument, because it does seem to suggest that these things didn't exist before this official canonizing of these concepts. So, anything through the First Council at Nicaea? That's kind of the details of it. Yes, ma'am?
Well, to me, it illustrates how foolish man is.
Yes.
Because, you were talking about all those things they put in place for deacons.
Yeah.
God did it in a few verses.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward. Talk about repentance, pretty straightforward. Talk about baptism, pretty
Yep.
straightforward. You and I had that conversation the other day about instrumental music.
Yep.
Let's take something simple that God commanded, and let's make it hard.
Yeah.
And hard to understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's just, it
Well,
drives home the point that we're fools.
yeah. Well, and not only that, but look at the basis upon which these canons are being issued. Does the Scriptures give us direction as to how to deal with people who don't accept the truth of the gospel?
Yeah.
Okay. Does the Scripture give us direction on how to establish deacons and how to establish elders?
Yes.
Does the church give us any understanding about whether or not, let's see, where was it? The first one or second one? No. Organizational structure of the church focused on the ordering of the episcopacy. Does the Scriptures, do they give us direction on how the New Testament church is to be organized? So ultimately, the basis upon which all of this is taking place is the assumption that either A, the New Testament Scriptures don't tell us, and so we have to make it up on our own, or B, we can change it. And that's ultimately where the Roman Catholic Church kind of fits in that spectrum, is the idea that because of the authority given to us from Jesus to Peter, and then from Peter to the first pope, or technically Peter wasn't a pope, so to the first Pope Linus, and then following, we have the authority to make changes as we see fit. Okay, Roman Catholic Church, really ultimately the vast majority of denominations, Mormonism, all of these fall apart if you simply help an individual to understand that there's no such thing as continual revelation or continuous revelation. That the Scriptures that God has given us somehow can be changed or revised or need to be updated. If you can defeat that thought, the vast majority of the fundamental beliefs of denominations fall apart. Because if you can't change anything, and it's only what the New Testament taught, then none of this is appropriate. None of this is right, which means Roman Catholicism falls apart. It's based on things that man has said rather than what God has said. The only assumption there is that we have the authority to change things. And of course, did Paul have the authority to change things? What did Paul tell the Galatians? If we or an angel from heaven teach to you anything other than what you've received, let him be accursed. That's pretty specific. That's pretty restrictive in authoritative nature, even coming from an apostle. Was Paul lesser than Peter? Therefore, Peter's authority had priority, and Paul was just mistaken? No. Yes, ma'am.
Well, someone posted on Facebook, I saw or something, and it said, and this is our problem today, is people want to make worship about them,
Yeah.
and worship is about God.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with my doctor the other day, and I told her where I went to church, and she goes, oh yeah, y'all don't use instrumental music. And she goes, I personally like some instruments with my singing.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say, so worship's about you. I didn't, I bit my tongue, but
Yeah.
You know, it's like we've forgotten. The majority of people today have made it about them.
Right.
And it is not about us.
Well,
we have one job. We were created to do one thing, and that is to obey God.
yeah. Yeah.
That's our only task, is to obey God.
I think a lot of times the line between me feeling these warm feelings and it being about God, those two things are kind of related to being the same thing. If I have these warm feelings and I feel good about it, then that means it's about God. But the two don't equate to one another.
And you're not going to have warm feelings if you've sinned and you need to repent.
No.
You're
No.
going to have yucky feelings.
Yeah, shameful. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Anything else through the First Council of Nicaea? Man changing what God has said, adding to and taking away. All right. We won't have time to get all the way through Athanasius, but he was the first to list all 27 New Testament books in one of his quote-unquote feastal letters. So every year, come time for Easter, these bishops over these regions, these archbishops, so to speak, would send out letters to all the churches, almost like a state of the church type address in the region type of thing. And every year at the Easter feast, they'd send these letters out. Well, Athanasius was the first to list the 27 New Testament books that we have. He listed them, at least in terms of the first written record of acknowledgement of the books of the Bible. This is the first one. Not that they weren't obviously God's word before that, but this is the first written example we have of someone recognizing that after the New Testament, has been given. So that kind of is what partly built into what is recognized as what's called the New Testament canon, the books that were approved, quote unquote, to be in the New Testament, the books that were rejected from being in the New Testament. It was the custom of the bishops of Alexandria to circulate a letter after Epiphany, that's January 6th, specifically dealing with it wasn't after Easter, I apologize. It had to do with Easter a little bit, but it was about Epiphany. Epiphany took place after the established time of when Jesus was born, so it was somewhere around that winter solstice type thing, which was ultimately December 25th. So around January 6th each year, establishing the date of Easter and therefore other movable feasts. They also took the occasion to discuss other matters. Athanasius wrote 45 feastal letters. Athanasius, this is his 39th feastal letter, written in 367, is widely regarded as a milestone in the, quote, evolution of the canon of New Testament books. Athanasius is the first person to identify the same 27, quote, first person to identify the same 27 books of the New Testament that are in use today. Up until then, various similar lists of works can be read in churches, or to be read in churches, were in use, but they just didn't. Some might leave one book out or included another book. A lot of the Apocrypha were included in these early, I hate to use the term Catholic churches because they're not referred to as that, but still keep in mind that the New Testament church acknowledged the scriptures of the New Testament. This is not considering the New Testament churches. All right. Up until then, Athanasius compiled the list to resolve questions about such texts as the Epistle of Barnabas. We'll talk a little bit about that. Athanasius includes the book of Baruch, the letter of Jeremiah. That's different from Jeremiah. Places the book of Esther among the 7 books not in the canon, but to be read, along with the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, Judith, Tobit, the Didache, and the Shepherd of Hermas. All this is considered Apocrypha. Why he considered Esther as being Apocrypha, we'll talk a little bit about that next Wednesday night. But in the end, he's important mainly because our New Testament books were the same ones he acknowledged as being New Testament books. End of story. All right, thank you everybody for the thoughts and comments. We'll pick up next week. Thank you everybody.